what are the implications of this case to begin with?
Oh, that's a very good and challenging question. I think there's lots of implications from this case. So as you said, Michael Correa was sentenced to 67.5 years in prison. He was sentenced in a US court. He's the third person to ever be sentenced for torture in the United States. And so this is impactful and meaningful for that reason alone, that, this is a case where the US has exercised jurisdiction over an individual who tortured people not in the United States, but in the Gambia. And they have demonstrated that they will ensure that torturers are brought to justice. Secondly, I think the impact of this case is this is the third Gambian to be tried and convicted and sentenced for crimes committed during the Yahya Jammeh regime outside of the Gambia. And I think that's impactful because the Gambia is on its own quest to find justice for the victims of the Jammeh regime. And I think all three of these cases, the case against Usman Sonko, the case against Bailo, and the case against Correa, are important because they continue to send a message to the Gambian government that the victims want justice. They want there to be accountability. They want the individuals who the Truth, Reconciliation, and Reparations Commission said, these people, these 70 individuals, need to be investigated and they need to be prosecuted. And I think these cases, including the case against Michael Sang Correa, show that the victims are waiting. They're waiting and they're getting impatient and they are ready for justice to be brought to the Gambia. There have been three individuals convicted of torture. The first, and only Korea is a Gambian.
Okay.
So the first one was Chucky Taylor, who was the son of Charles Taylor, and he was the head of the anti-terrorism unit in Liberia during the Second Liberian Civil War and during his father's presidency. He was a US citizen and he was prosecuted for torture that he committed as the head of the ATU in Liberia. The second person that was prosecuted and convicted of torture in the US is an American man called Ross Roggio, who was convicted for torture that was committed in Iraq, where in the Kurdish region of Iraq. And he had both tortured individuals himself, but also directed Kurdish soldiers to commit torture against individuals. And then the third trial and conviction was that of Michael Sang Correa, the former jungler who was convicted of torture in April of this year, and then sentenced yesterday.
As a legal practitioner involved in this case, I mean, what is your take on this so far, especially defense argument about trying to shield Michael Correa from this act of torture?
So the defense, the defense counsel was doing their job. I think every defendant, regardless of the crimes they've committed, is entitled to a robust legal defense. And that's what Correa got yesterday. That his lawyer was arguing for Correa to receive the lowest sentence that was reasonable. And what he was arguing for was a sentence of, if I remember correctly, 87 months, which is about 7 years. And he based that argument on a number of things. The first argument that you highlighted was that, he should serve the 7 years, and then he should be sent back to the Gambia to face prosecution for all of the other crimes that he is accused of and was accused of in the TRC report. Um, and, I know that there are a lot of people who probably would agree with that or would feel that that was a reasonable argument to make. the crimes that Correa was charged with in the United States are very narrow. As a jungler, Correa was accused of many, many crimes, and what was brought forth in the United States was just torture and just in relation to one specific incident, which was the attempted coup in March 2006. And I know for a number of victims, a lot of victims in the Gambia, that isn't enough. That doesn't encompass the true magnitude of what Correa as a jungler did. Um, but I think, and so on the one hand, I think the defense made a very reasonable argument. On the other hand, we know that the Gambia currently is in the process of trying to establish a court that could prosecute the junglers for the crimes that they committed. That right now, the Gambia does not have the legal and technical capacity, but it is in the process of developing it and putting it together and making sure that it has a robust mechanism. Right? They've recently passed the Special Accountability Mechanism Bill, and the Special Prosecutor's Office is being established. That's in process. And I hope that in 7 years, it will be established and ready to prosecute somebody like Correa. I just don't know for sure that that would be the case. And I know that for a lot of the victims, it's more important that Correa is sentenced to a heavy sentence, like the sentence that he received yesterday, and that sentence will send a message to the Gambia that other junglers like Correa should receive similar sentences. Um, so that's sort of the first argument. The second argument was that, he didn't have a choice, that he was just following orders. We heard from some of the victims yesterday, including, one of my clients, that torture is wrong and that soldiers in the GAF, even soldiers who were in the GAF during the Jammeh regime, they knew that torture was wrong. They knew that they had a responsibility to refuse to obey illegal orders. And there were soldiers and even junglers who refused, who made that choice, made the moral choice to not do that thing, not to cross that line. And yes, some of them, it cost them their lives, but for some, it didn't. Some were able to escape and go into exile. But Correa chose not to make that choice. He chose to torture. He chose to allegedly commit many other crimes. And I think, as somebody who I was speaking to yesterday put a very fine point on it, when you make that choice over and over and over again, it's not just that you're following orders. You are consciously making a decision over and over and over again to commit bad things. It's a pattern. It's not that you're just following an order. It was something he had a choice. He could have said no. He could have tried to flee, but he decided not to.
Why wouldn't the Gambia government or the Gambian authorities try these people in the Gambia instead for outsiders to help restore hope to victims who thought this was, unthinkable, or justice wouldn't have been delivered?
I think it's interesting because I work in a lot of different countries, not just the Gambia. And in the Gambia, what I see, and I'm an outsider, I'm not a victim of the Jammeh regime. And so in some ways, I have privilege. I have immense privilege. But what I see is that there is movement, right? Like I mentioned before, there are bills that have been passed, laws that are being passed to set up a court that could try these individuals. And I know it's happening slowly, and I know the movement it's the victims need that hope. They need the constant reminder that justice is possible, it is coming. And it's been for some people, it's been over almost 3 decades since the atrocities started. Um, and it is happening slowly, but the Gambian government is making small incremental progress towards establishing some kind of process that could try these individuals. I don't see the two as conflicting, right? I think when trials happen outside of the Gambia, because that's where the people are, right? Usman Sonko was living in Switzerland, Bailo was living in Germany, Correa was living in the United States. When countries find a torturer or somebody who's committed gross human rights violations or crimes against humanity in their country, they have an obligation themselves to prosecute those individuals and investigate them and prosecute them if that's appropriate. And so the US, Germany, Switzerland, they're just following through on their own international obligations. And in a sense, showing an example for the Gambia that it's possible, that the evidence exists, that, the witnesses want to come forward and present testimony. And so it's like these are small steps. It doesn't have to be either or. And I do think there is hope that the Gambia is moving forwards on a process where these prosecutions could take place in the Gambia.
How did you hear about this case victim that you stood up for in defense?
Again, a very good question. The way that we got involved was the Gambian civil society organizations came to us after Correa was arrested initially for visa for overstaying his visa. So Michael Correa was arrested in 2019 initially because he had um, in, wrongfully entered the United States on an expired visa and then stayed. And when that happened, a number of Gambian victims organizations, the Victims Center, Solo Sandek Foundation, ANACED, got in touch with us and said, hey, this guy is a torturer. Is there any way that he could be prosecuted for torture or other crimes in the United States rather than just the visa, using an expired visa? And so we then got in touch with witnesses who could, help prove that he had committed torture. And with our Gambian colleagues and a coalition of international organizations, including Trial International, us, CJA, Human Rights Watch, and others, we then began a long campaign of advocacy with the US government and to have Korea indicted for crimes other than just overstaying and using an expired visa. We managed to, along other people joined in our efforts. So Senator Durbin and sent a letter to the Department of Justice laying out why he felt that it was important that Correa was charged with torture. And in 2020, that's what happened. Correa was indicted for the torture of the victims. And so that was really the beginning of our engagement on this case. We were then, through that work, introduced to our clients and learned became more involved and started to represent them in the process under what's called the Crime Victims' Rights Act in the United States.
But so now let's move on to the case. This is unprecedented for any Gambian outside the Gambia or even in the Gambia. No Gambian has ever been sentenced 67 and a half years. So where do we go from here, especially you taking the perspective from the CGA for the five victims that you stood up for?
I think, as we heard yesterday during the sentencing, each of our clients said very succinctly that what their hope is that this case sends a message to the Gambia that justice is possible, that justice is important, and that accountability must be shown to be, must come forward, and that the junglers and other people who committed crimes during the Yahya Jammeh regime must have their day in court. And so we will continue to work with our Gambian civil society colleagues, with AVLO, to put pressure on the Gambian government to support the Gambian government in their quest to establish the special tribunal.
So, what role do you hope to play in the future prosecution of other junglers or other torturers who are trying to evade arrest, whether they are within the West African sub-region or other parts of the world?
Whatever role our colleagues need us to play, we stand ready to support. You know, my area of expertise is limited. I'm a US attorney, I'm a lawyer in the US, not in the Gambia, so there are limits. But we want to be helpful and supportive, and we'll do what we can.